The engine died high above the Yukon, in air cold enough to freeze bare skin in minutes. No road below, no houses, and no radio contact anyone was hearing. Helen thought she had minutes to live. She didn't know she was starting a 49-day fight to stay alive. Most of it after the official search for her had already been called off. On paper she was dead. In reality, she was just getting started. And the craziest part, if the plane had gone just 20 meters further, this could have been a 2-day rescue, not a 49-day nightmare. This is the true story of 21-year-old Helen Klaben from Brooklyn, and pilot Ralph Flores, a father of 6, and how they survived in a place where cold usually kills in hours. To understand how they ended up trapped in a broken plane in the middle of nowhere, we have to rewind to before the engine went silent. Helen grew up in Brooklyn, subways, sidewalks, apartment buildings. Winter meant slush and heavy coats, not -40 in the wilderness. By the early 1960s, that life felt too small. She didn't want a safe desk job. She hit the road instead, hitchhiking, taking odd jobs, drifting from town to town. Eventually, that drifting took her far north. Alaska, then down into Canada. Into a world of small airstrips and bush pilots, men who knew the mountains by feel more than by maps. One of those pilots was Ralph Flores. Ralph was 42, a Mexican-American mechanic, part-time pilot, Mormon, and father of 6. He'd flown many hours in the north. He knew snow, wind, and mountains, as long as the weather stayed clear. But there was one line on his license that mattered more than he realized. He did not have an instrument rating. He was not certified to fly only by instruments in cloud. In simple words, flying blind in bad visibility was something he was not supposed to do. In early February 1963, Helen needed to get from Whitehorse, in Canada's Yukon, to Fort St. John in British Columbia. By winter road, that trip was long, rough, and uncertain. Through a mutual acquaintance in Watson Lake, she heard about a seat on a small, single-engine plane. The pilot, Ralph Flores. The route, roughly where she needed to go. She paid for the seat. No one insisted on a full survival kit. In that time and place, for some pilots, emergency gear still felt like extra weight. On February 4, 1963, they took off from Whitehorse. 2 people, 1 small plane. The Yukon winter spread out below them. At first, the view could almost have been beautiful. Endless white, dark lines of spruce forest, frozen rivers like silver scars across the land. But February in the Yukon is not just scenery. It's a test. Short days, long bitter nights. Temperatures down to -30, -40 and below. Cold that seeps into metal and takes the strength out of engines and people. As they flew south, the sky began to close in. Clouds thickened. The ceiling dropped. Visibility shrank. Ralph knew these skies, but only in clear weather. Without an instrument rating, cloud was his enemy. Too low, and you risk unseen hills and trees. Too high, and you're inside the cloud with no real horizon, no clear outside reference. For a pilot not trained for that, it's a trap. At some point, he lost his exact position. The ground below turned into a blur of white and gray. The sun was just a faint, glowing disk behind the clouds. They drifted off course. The fuel gauges kept creeping toward empty. There was no GPS. No satellite tracking. No constant weather updates in the cockpit. Just a small aircraft and a lot of empty air. Then, without warning, the engine began to cough. For a few seconds it struggled, and then it died. The roar vanished. The propeller spun freely. The only sound was the rush of wind over thin aluminum. Below them, trees in every direction. No roads, no clearings big enough to land safely. In that moment, Helen thought, this is it. Minutes left, maybe seconds. Ralph did what he could. He tried to keep the wings level. Tried to pick the least terrible place to come down. The plane hit a heavily forested slope. Trees smashed the wings and tore at the fuselage. Metal bent, windows shattered, loose items flew forward. But those same trees also absorbed some of the force. They turned a deadly fall into a brutal crash that 2 people could survive. Then everything went quiet. When Helen opened her eyes, nothing looked familiar. The cabin was twisted and tilted, half buried in snow. The world was suddenly very small. Pain hit next. Her foot was badly broken. One arm was seriously injured. Her face and chin were cut from the impact. Beside her, Ralph was in terrible shape too. His jaw was broken. His cheek and ribs were injured. Even breathing hurt. Outside the torn metal, deep snow pressed up against the wreck. Inside, the air was barely warmer. The cold bit instantly at any exposed skin. And then they realized something else. There was no proper survival kit. No flare gun. No emergency radio signal reaching anyone. No stash of warm and tour gear. All they had was what they'd packed as travelers. And for food, a tiny collection that, in any normal situation, you might finish in one long movie night. 4 small cans of sardines. 2 cans of tuna. 2 cans of fruit. A bit of chocolate. And some powdered Tang drink mix. That was it. Imagine waking up in a crashed plane, in deep snow, knowing that's all the food you have with no idea how long you'll be there. Before they could even think about rationing properly, they had to deal with their injuries. There was no doctor. No bandages waiting in a clean drawer. Out there, treatment meant whatever they could improvise. Ralph tried to steady his broken jaw with his hands, carefully pushing it into a position where it would move less and hurt slightly less. He tried to help Helen straighten and support her injured arm, using what they had. Scraps of wood, torn fabric, bits of metal as makeshift splints. It wasn't neat, it wasn't clean. But it was something. They made a decision early. They would stay with the wreck. A crashed plane is bigger, brighter, and easier to see from the air than 2 injured people on foot in the snow. Leaving it, especially in their condition, would almost certainly mean getting lost and never being found. So they started turning the broken cabin into a shelter. They dragged seats into place, packed snow up around the outside for extra insulation, hung whatever fabric they could find to block gaps and drafts. It wasn't comfortable. It wasn't even truly warm. It was just a little less deadly than the open forest. Then they opened their cans and made a plan. They would ration everything. A bite or 2 here, a spoonful there. The Tang powder mixed into melted snow became their treat, a bit of color and taste in a world of white and metal. But the Yukon winter doesn't care about human plans. Outside, it was the kind of cold where your breath turns to ice instantly. And touching bare metal with bare skin can be dangerous. Inside, they wore every layer they had. Clothes, blankets, seat cushions. Anything to slow the cold creeping in. At night, the temperature fell even further. The thin aluminum skin of the plane carried that cold straight into their bodies. They tried to build small fires when they could. They burned bits of broken wood and any fuel they could safely spare. Keeping a flame alive was work. Finding dry fuel in deep snow was even harder. Every step outside, even for a few meters, sucked away energy they didn't have. Slowly, the cold started to claim a price. Their fingers and toes went numb. Color and feeling faded. Later, doctors would call it severe frostbite. Helen would lose parts of several toes. But in the wreck, in those first days, all they knew was that each day they could move a little less. For the first 10 days, they stretched their food as far as humanly possible. A small bite of fish. A little fruit. A sip of hot, sweet Tang. On the 10th day, they scraped out the last can. From that morning on, there was no food. Only snow and hot water. Imagine being so hungry that your body screams for food. And all you can offer it is warmth in a cup. While they were melting snow and counting every sip far away, people were looking for them. When the plane didn't arrive at Fort St. John, authorities launched a search. But they faced a huge problem. No radar track, no clear route, no exact last position. The search area was enormous. Mountains, forest, frozen rivers. Hundreds of square kilometers of white. Day after day, pilots flew grid patterns over the wilderness. Ground teams checked whatever tracks and roads they could reach. Radio messages crackled through headsets. No sign of wreckage. No tracks. Visibility dropping. Snowstorms erased any marks on the ground. At first, people hoped. Maybe a forced landing somewhere. Maybe a radio failure. Maybe they'd show up walking into a town, cold but alive. But as days turned into weeks, hope began to thin. Fuel is limited. Pilots get tired. Search budgets run out. In offices far from the crash site, the language started to change. No likely survivors. Area extensively searched. Recommend termination. One by one, the search planes turned back for the last time. Maps were folded. Files were stamped and filed away. On paper, Helen and Ralph were now 3 words. Missing, presumed dead. Out in the snow, inside that torn-up cabin, they melted another pan of snow. And had no idea that officially, no one was coming anymore. Inside the wreck, they built a rhythm of survival. Wake up. Check for any remaining ember of fire. Melt snow, sip hot water slowly. Move their fingers and toes as best they could to keep the blood flowing. Talk when Ralph's jaw allowed it. They also prayed. Ralph leaned on his Mormon faith. Helen, who had been searching for meaning in life before the crash, now searched for it in the middle of a frozen forest. Each time they woke up, they reminded themselves of one simple fact. We're still alive. So the story isn't over yet. They knew they couldn't just wait passively. They had to try to be seen. Despite his broken ribs and injured jaw, Ralph forced himself to climb a tall tree near the crash site, about 60 feet high. Step by painful step, he pulled himself upward, carrying bright scraps from the plane. At the top, he hung them where they might catch the eye of anyone flying overhead. Every move cost him. Every slip could have been fatal. He did it anyway. On the ground, he used his strength to stamp a giant SOS into the snow near a clearing. Letter by letter, walking back and forth in deep snow, he carved it out. Each step a shout into the sky, we're here. To move through that deep snow, he built homemade snowshoes. He took scraps of wood and straps, lashed them together into rough ovals, and tied them to his boots. Crude, but better than sinking up to his hips in every step. Twice he tried to walk out for help, leaving Helen alone in the wreck. Twice the terrain, his injury, and his weakness forced him back. He couldn't go far. He couldn't just leave her there forever. They were stuck together. By now weeks had passed. The cans were long empty. Their bodies were getting thinner and weaker. Hunger had turned into a constant dull pain. Their clothes hung looser. Simple movements felt like heavy work. But something else was changing too, the season. Slowly, the deepest winter began to ease. Days stretched a little longer. It was still deadly cold, just not always that instant biting February freeze. Near the end of the 7th week, Ralph knew they couldn't go on like this. They were running out of time. He made one more decision. He would try again. One last time. This time, the choice he made would finally bring another plane to them. But not in the way he expected. He would follow a frozen river. Rivers, even in the wilderness, often lead toward people, cabins, trap lines, power lines, small settlements. If there was any sign of life around, chances were good it would be somewhere along that icy path. By now, they were shadows of who they'd been. Severely underweight. Feet and hands damaged by the cold. Even sitting up for too long made them dizzy. Staying meant slowly fading away. Leaving meant risking a collapse alone in the trees. Ralph adjusted his homemade snowshoes as best he could. Gathered what tiny supplies he could carry. Looked at Helen and told her to stay with the wreck. To tend any visible signal she could. To hold on. Then he stepped out into the white. Each step pressed an odd, wide footprint into the snow on the frozen river. Those footprints would later become the first clue anyone would see. On March 26, 1963, another pilot, 32-year-old Chuck Hamilton, was flying a routine trip out of Watson Lake. From high above, the frozen river below him looked smooth and empty. Just another strip of white in a land of white. Then something caught his eye. Lines. Curves. A pattern scratched into the surface. He circled lower, staring. Those weren't cracks in the ice. They weren't animal tracks. They were the marks of homemade snowshoes. And then he saw it. A giant SOS stamped into the snow on the river. In the middle of the Yukon wilderness, that could only mean one thing. Someone was alive down there. Hamilton brought his plane down as close as he safely could. As he moved across the snow, he saw a thin, ragged man stumbling toward him. For a moment, he thought it might be a trapper. Some recluse living alone in the forest. But as the man came closer, the truth was obvious. He was far too weak, too injured, too desperate. This was Ralph Flores. With his damaged jaw, Ralph struggled to speak. But the message got through. There was another survivor. A young woman. Still back at the crash site. Hamilton took him aboard and flew back into the air, following Ralph's directions and the signs on the ground. Soon, in a tangle of trees and snow, they saw it. The broken shape of a small aircraft. Inside, they found Helen. 49 days after the crash. She was still alive. The flight out wasn't long. But it marked the end of one life and the beginning of another. First, they were taken to nearby settlements for emergency care. Then to better-equipped hospitals. Doctors were stunned. Helen had lost around 40 pounds. Ralph nearly 58. Both were severely undernourished. Both had serious frostbite. Helen would lose parts of several toes. Ralph's facial injuries and ribs needed real surgery and time. Newspapers heard about the story and spread it fast. Pictures showed Helen in a hospital bed, thin but smiling. Ralph with bandages on his jaw, eyes tired but alive. Headlines called it a miracle in the Yukon. A 49-day ordeal. But once the first wave of amazement faded, two stories began to form. One was about courage. A badly injured pilot climbing trees, building snowshoes, stamping SOS into the snow, refusing to give up. And a young woman enduring brutal cold and hunger, sticking to rationing, accepting rough treatment, and holding on mentally when quitting would have been easy. The other story asked harder questions. Why no proper survival kit? Why fly into worsening cloud without an instrument rating? Could flares, warmer clothing, or better planning have turned 49 days into just a few? Both sides were real. Both mattered. In the late 1960s, Helen told the story in her own words, in a book called Hey, I'm Alive. She didn't paint herself or Ralph as flawless heroes. She wrote about their mistakes, their arguments, their fear, and also about the stubborn thread of will that ran through all 49 days. Ralph kept flying for some time, but the crash and its story stayed with him. To some, he was a hero of survival. To others, a warning about respecting the limits of training and equipment in the wilderness. What makes their ordeal stand out, even among extreme survival stories, is how many things were against them at once. Almost no food. Temperatures often far below freezing. Serious injuries. No full survival pack. No working radio contact. And 7 full weeks alone, in one of the harshest environments on Earth. People sometimes survive short bursts of cold, with the right gear. People sometimes survive long periods in the wild, with food and proper shelter. Helen and Ralph survived almost none of those advantages. And then there's that one haunting detail. Later analysis suggested that if the powerless plane had just glided about 20 meters further, barely a few more seconds of flight, it likely would have come down in a clearer, more open spot. A place where search planes in those first days and weeks might easily have seen it. They were, in a way, incredibly unlucky. And incredibly lucky at the same time. Unlucky in where they struck the ground. Lucky in how the trees broke their fall. Lucky that both of them found just enough strength every day to last until March 26. Stories like this are often told as simple hero tales. But real survival is messier than that. People underestimate risk, skip precautions, and make choices they later regret. And then, when everything falls apart, they discover how far their will can stretch. Helen and Ralph did what many of us hope we would do, but can't be sure of until the moment comes. They took stock of what they had. They made a plan, even if it wasn't perfect. They adjusted it as things got worse. They supported each other. And they refused to assume their story was over, until reality forced them to stop. If you're still here, these true survival stories clearly speak to you. Take a second to like the video, it helps more people find them. And subscribe if you want more real stories, from frozen forests and remote islands to deserts, oceans, and beyond. Because there are many more quiet acts of courage still waiting to be told. Helen and Ralph started that flight as two ordinary people on a routine trip. By the time it ended, they had proved just how far an ordinary human being can go. Even after the world has quietly written you off as dead.